With data centers, there's a large drive to have as higher reliability and higher uptime, and you're talking 9.999% type reliability level. So this is looking at like N-1 and -2 level redundancy in substations, and they tend to be less sensitive to CapEx constraints. So we're really looking at like a more holistic design, or like a reliability redundancy first level design approach rather than a sort of CapEx optimization.
We're gathered here today to have a discussion about data centers and how they're becoming a more important aspect in the electricity system in the UK, and how we see it in the UK kind of context, and maybe then going into a little bit more of a broader terms. So we're gathered by consultants from Clough Consulting, Caspar and Siddharth, and myself, Vilhjalmur, will be leading the discussion. So starting off maybe on just the increase in interest on data centers. So what sort of indicators are we seeing that this is becoming a more interesting topic to discuss?
Yeah, so NISO had done a survey where they'd reached out to all of the developers that held a data center connection offer. And based on the results of that kind of survey, I mean, it was mainly focused at transmission connected data centers, but there was around like 150 gigawatts of data centers in the queue, out of which 20 to 25 were significantly progressed with FID and planning. So it just shows you that the queue is massive. The scale of progressed projects is also massive, and there's also been a recent publication that Ofgem are going to conduct a demand reforms as well, similar to what they did for generation. So it's a very fast-moving landscape currently, and with AI growing at the pace that it is, there's a lot of interest from developers as to how can they access grid as quickly as they can to build data centers.
In that context, what are the sort of hindrances we're seeing? So what is it that developers might be looking into to kind of secure a grid connection, or what sort of kind of services can be provided to them to investigate the possibility of connecting?
Yeah, I think one of the hindrances that a lot of demand customers are facing now, which was similar to what generation customers were facing from the last few years, is that a lot of the substations seem to not have any more import headroom available. So there's a lot of the work that we do at Clough is trying to understand the impact of BESS attrition as a result of connections reform, and how that BESS attrition frees up import headroom at particular substations. And we try to recommend strategies like maybe a phased approach or slightly staged connection strategies to data centers that they could utilize that kind of import headroom and connect earlier. At least one phase of theirs could connect earlier. So that's what we do at Clough. And in general, we also offer support in terms of data center feasibility, where we don't just look at import headroom. We also consider some other wider factors, such as the availability of dark fiber network around the particular site location. We look at the water sources available, how whether it's like a scarce water region or not. We look at what the aptitude of the planning councils is in terms of data center development. And we provide developers with a more holistic overview of whether a site is a good spot for building out a new data center.
Are we seeing any sorts of trends, or are there specific regions that might be better suited to these connections, maybe where you could more easily get a grid connection, or there's maybe more headroom available, or is it maybe kind of just spread out over the entire country?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most interest from data center developers themselves is typically around like Slough and London, because they all want to be close to the kind of big population and user hubs. We're also seeing slowly as the grid is getting, or has already been constrained, especially around London, they're moving out and considering other locations as well. As per the AI Growth Zone publication, the government has indicated like some subsidies for certain regions, and Scotland is one of them. And we think that in the future, Scotland's could potentially be like a potential hot target for data centers. given that the SSCP modeling is also trying to shift demand above the Scottish border, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense with all the growth in offshore generation in Scotland, and then the already constrained boundaries in the north, like the B6, etc. So it makes a lot of sense to price more demand in Scotland. So I'm sure that will be trying to incentivize that in ways they can.
But do we see any correlation with maybe at what voltage levels they seem to be wanting to connect into? I assume kind of the large scale projects, of course, will be considering to go into transmission, but is it mostly going into transmission, or is there some maybe going even into distribution as well?
No, it's a mix of both. So at transmission, connecting a data center is kind of like, it's permissible, but it's a bit of a gray area in terms of like being able to own and build out HV assets, because that's technically not exactly allowed. Like you have to go through a TO, or potentially if demand reforms come in, then an ITO who'd have to build out and own that network asset for you. So we're seeing connections, for example, in England and Wales up to 132 kV at transmission, and then you're having the TO NJET essentially build out that 132 to 400 kV substation for you. So it's a mix of both. Obviously, I think that timeline of having a substation needing to be built is much longer at transmission. So to avoid that, a lot of developers are looking at targeting distribution so that they can utilize existing GSPs that are already built, and try to slide in the import headroom available at those existing GSPs.
The UK hasn't really, or the NISO hasn't really published any kind of guidance towards kind of connecting data centers, including kind of behavior of loads under kind of system contingencies hasn't maybe been of uttermost importance kind of in the past decades, but it's becoming more important now. Is there any kind of specific reasons why we deem data centers to be maybe more problematic than your traditional kind of large scale loads in the network?
Yeah, I think it's just the scale and the size of these assets. So, when you're talking about like multi-gigawatt assets, the risk of loss on the assets in faults or cascading failures, you could look at like very severe frequency events on the system. So, we're seeing more requirements in terms of things like fault ride-through coming in many countries, and this is the ability of like assets to basically ride through voltage drops or rises, and making sure that they're more resilient, and so we have less tripping events. So it's those kinds of assets. Also, because they're tend to be like controlled load types, it's not something that's entirely passive, and they have more potentially more impact in terms of harmonics and things like that. There's also more emphasis on the modeling side of it as well. Obviously, it's a fairly new area, so there's a lot more sort of fears of what we don't know could be. So requirements such as having to build and submit EMT models, for example, to NISO, as well as other power quality studies and things like that, are going to be more common. But at the moment, the grid code is pretty sparse when it comes to demand connections and data centers specifically. So mostly these requirements are being placed into the connection agreements. So it's kind of still an evolving area. We're expecting to see more. But yeah, we have some experience from other countries as well. So we're seeing quite different rules in different parts of Europe. So it'll be interesting to see how that progresses, because it's quite different to the generation landscape.
Yes, it's definitely a very kind of interesting point in terms of the power quality. What we've also been seeing is kind of a little bit of an interest in investigating different technology types in terms of kind of assisting the data centers in improving compliance and being able to meet power quality requirements. So what sort of technologies have we maybe been seeing developers consider when it comes to these sorts of studies?
We had some interest in like co-location of data centers and battery energy projects. So both in terms of some developers who have existing battery connections and trying to sort of convert those or connect behind the meter to data centers and like get the most commercially other assets, as well as others who are looking to use like co-location of batteries to also support in terms of like meter grid code requirements for reactive power or for fault ride through, etc. So could be an interesting area.
Maybe touching on that a little bit more in terms of co-locating. So when you're co-locating, for example, with batteries, you might have existing connections in the system for batteries, for example. Do we see, maybe Siddharth, any interest in, for example, where you have built the battery, they might want to also put a data center behind the meter? Is that something we're seeing an interest in?
Yeah, we are. We're seeing an interest in the behind the meter kind of approach to developing data centers and using that to kind of get access to grid faster. Obviously, like to preface it, it needs to be done quite carefully in terms of you not having, or like the developers not triggering additional license conditions or license obligations. Maybe like a supply license or something, you'd have to be careful that that's not required. And there's also considerations as to the addition of the data center and how that, especially if you're co-locating it and you're adding the data center on later on after the BESS, how that impacts the kind of modeling that the network operators have already done for like the thermal profile modeling, fault level modeling, and you have to kind of ensure that you're not worsening it. Otherwise, you'd be put at the back of the queue. So you kind of have to make that argument very strategically and it probably requires a lot of collaboration with and proactiveness on your side as a developer with NISO in terms of trying to ensure that you're within requirements, you're within license conditions, and you're not worsening the impact of whatever you're trying to do onto the project behind you in the queue.
Definitely interesting to see kind of how this can be kind of further evolved in the future and kind of just trying to make as good use as you can of your existing connection agreements. But maybe following a little bit up on that topic, as we're seeing maybe more batteries, for example, or other types of technologies being co-located with something like data center, or at least ideas of it, is there an interest in also kind of using then those assets commercially, or is that maybe a hindrance due to kind of existing conditions?
It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to add it without necessarily changing the queue position and kind of maintaining the best operational envelope, then you'd have to come up with some kind of a commercial agreement with the best operator in terms of when you'd be buying power from them versus when you'd be buying power from the grid. So there's some commercial kind of arrangements as well that developers would need to think of before entering into this kind of an arrangement. And at Blake Clough, we do have capabilities to kind of support you with those kind of behind the meter or power to X kind of solutions, essentially. So we do a lot of revenue modeling. We do a lot of the assessment of regulations and license conditions, and we advise you on the general grid connection strategy that you could use to facilitate such connections.
Is there kind of anything we can explicitly say that like causes issues by not having this clarity in terms of kind of public frameworks for compliance, for example, for these sorts of projects? Is it maybe making more uncertainty or could cause some issues in terms of like how you approach the investment?
As I said, to the moment, most of the requirements are defined on a project basis in the connection agreements. So it depends a bit on when you received your connection and what the requirements are defined in there. But it could look quite different, and as I said, it's very different between countries as well. If NISO looked to change it in the future, you would hope that it only applies to new connections from that point. But hard to know. You never know with these things. So, but yeah, it could be this case that if, for example, fault write-through requirements are changing in terms of current injection or something like that, or active power recovery post-fault, it could become something in which you require to install additional technology that you hadn't maybe accounted for in your financial model or like in your substation planning.
Yeah.
So yeah, not having clarity with these things is never good.
Maybe touching a little bit more on that subject. There isn't really maybe a standardized way of designing like a data center co-located with another technology type. So what sort of kind of modeling could we provide for some developers with that can maybe assist them in making decisions on how to design their electrical systems? For some, what sort of options maybe do they have, and could they make a comparison between different designs?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have the capabilities to develop like EMT models for lots of battery projects, we've worked on obviously many in the UK, as well as building out models for data centers. We can look at various operational configurations or connection arrangements as well, and looking at how best to provide the design and achieve, meet the technical requirements of the connection agreements.
The criteria for designing a substation when you're connecting a data center versus maybe in general generation projects might be a bit different. So what sorts of factors need to be accounted for when considering designing for data centers versus maybe normal generation projects?
Yeah, for data centers compared to generation, the main difference is kind of the requirements in terms of reliability. And typically when you're doing a generation project and you're designing the customer substation, you are usually optimizing for lowest capex, and you're optimizing your design that way. And then things like redundancy and reliability are kind of a bit of an afterthought. You can have certain arrangements, bus couplers, to try and maximize that, but usually it's mainly driven by capex. Whereas with data centers, there's a large drive to have as higher reliability and higher uptime, and you're talking 9.999% type reliability levels. So this is looking at N-1 and -2 level redundancy in substations, and they tend to be less sensitive to capex constraints. So we're really looking at a more holistic design, or a reliability redundancy first level design approach, rather than a sort of capex optimization.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to the panel for discussing this interesting topic on data center, which is becoming ever more important to discuss. If you have any questions or any queries, please feel free to reach out to Clough Consulting.